Last week we started the Advent season. That consists of the 4 weeks that lead up to Christmas Day. And as you could probably tell from what we did to the lyrics to God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, we're not afraid to reinterpret our traditions and deviate from traditional Christian theology where it suits us. That's because, in case you hadn't noticed it, a lot of the traditional Christmas carols and hymns are filled with references to what I like to call the 3 S's: sin, Satan, and salvation. So sometimes we tweak the words, sometimes we outright change the words where we can, and where that doesn't work, then we need to find a way to still enjoy the music without taking the lyrics literally. We may not believe in the literal truth of virgin birth and angel choirs singing in the sky, but we can still enjoy the stories, and we can still appreciate what those stories have to say about the human condition over the centuries and how human beings tried to make sense of this situation that we find ourselves in through really no fault or will of our own. Here we are, what do we make of it? And those are the stories that we tell. In fact, one of the things that I like to do when I get the chance at Christmas is to listen to a radio program called A Festival of 9 Lessons and Carols. Has anyone heard of A Festival of 9 Lessons and Carols? It's broadcast live from King's College at Cambridge University in England. And this has been going on for many, many, many years now. It's broadcast on the BBC, and then it's picked up here on the local NPR stations, and they broadcast it live. It's usually sometime in the morning on Christmas Eve, a very traditional Anglican service. They call it a high church kind of service that consists basically, literally, of 9 lessons taken from the scriptures, and then each one of those lessons is accompanied with a carol. And the lessons stay the same. They change the carols from year to year, except for a few that are like set pieces, the opening piece, and another couple of them in there are ones that they do every year. But it's a beautiful, beautiful service. And I was looking at the list of the lessons that they offer, and I noticed that 2 of the 9 lessons come from the book of Isaiah. 2 out of the 9 come from the book of Isaiah, which is one of the books of prophecy in the Hebrew Bible. I mentioned last week that there are basically 2 kinds of prophets that you find in those days. The one kind of prophet is the doom and gloom, scolding gadfly who's telling everyone that they're doing it all wrong. I think I said that that's the kind of prophet that doesn't get invited to many holiday parties because they always want to talk politics and stuff like that. But then you have the other kind of prophet. You have this prophet like Isaiah, who wanted to give people a sense of hope, wanted to give them a lift, wanted to give them a little encouragement in bleak times and to try to assure them that better times were to come. So Isaiah was one of the guys with a message of hope. He tried to tell the people that there would come a time of peace and prosperity. And one of the ways that he described it was like this. He said, "The wolf shall live with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them." Those were words of hope for people in a country that was torn with strife and oppression and invasions and enemies all around them, supposedly. And I know this isn't exactly a humorous passage, but there was an artist who apparently thought about what this must look like when the wolf lies down with the lamb and so on and so forth. So here's one artist's rendition of what that might look like. It's a wolf playing leapfrog with a sheep. I thought that's what it might look like if wolves hung out with sheep and they played together. Because really that's what the passage is trying to get across. Boundaries would come down between traditional enemies, between predator and prey, and everybody would get together and play and get along. Traditional enemies would become friends. That was the assurance that this prophet was trying to give. And the reason this gets tied into the Christmas season, Isaiah is quoted all the time during the Christmas season. The reason for that is because the Gospels have Jesus saying some similar things. For example, These passages from chapter 6 in the book of Luke. It's the sermon on the, well, it's not the Sermon on the Mount in Luke. It's the sermon down on the plain is where it's given. So here's Jesus talking, and he says, "But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." I call this the most ignored passage in the Christian scriptures. Even biblical fundamentalists figure out ways to not take this literally. Interesting how that works. Because I've said it before, I'll say it again. We don't take the Bible literally here, but we do take it seriously. So whoever wrote this was offering a new vision of how we ought to be showing up in the world, how we might show up in the world. And anyone who considers Jesus to be either a teacher, a source of wisdom, inspiration, or even a savior, anyone who considers Jesus to be any of those things at least needs to take it seriously, if not literally. For those who say they take the Bible literally, as I say, they don't take this literally. But a lot of people resist it. They ignore it because they think it requires us to allow ourselves to be harmed. That's not what it's saying. Don't take it so literally. The idea of being struck on the cheek is an insult. It's a slight. It's not literally someone looking to clobber you. I mean, if someone is out to harm you, block it, defend yourself, run away. That's not what they're getting at in this passage. There's nothing here that requires us to be a doormat. Not true. Here's an affirmation for you. I am not your doormat. I am not your doormat. And while I was looking for this one, I just happened across a couple of others, and I thought, well, maybe for those of you who haven't finished your Christmas shopping yet, this might give you a few ideas. Here's another one. Definitely not a trap door. You have to think about that one. That's pretty good. How about this? You again? One more. I like this one. The dog is okay, but the human bites. That would go well at our house, wouldn't it? So you don't have to be a doormat based on this passage. Jesus isn't telling us that we must allow ourselves to be harmed. This isn't about how to respond to someone who is physically attacking us. If we face a physical attack, we defend ourselves or we run away. Get out of Dodge, as they say. But how often is that a reality for most of us here? Unless we're on the police force or in a war zone, the enemy rarely takes the form of a physical attack for most of us. So the idea of an enemy, and that's really what this passage is getting at, is asking us to think about who is the enemy. Who do we brand as an enemy? Because the idea of enemy goes way beyond someone just making a physical attack. I got a great definition of an enemy from a book called The Eye of the Storm by Unity minister Gary Simmons. Gary says that the enemy is anyone or anything that we think is against us. And we know that we're dealing with the enemy when our first inclination in responding is to try to control them and to be right and make the other person wrong. So the enemy, our response to the enemy can take the form of anger, judgment, criticism, rudeness. And those are the kind of things that when they're directed at us, makes us label them enemy. The enemy is the ideology that we might happen to disagree with and brand as a personal threat. The enemy might be the person whose lifestyle we disagree with, so we refuse to connect with them or engage them. You know, a few years ago, you might remember this popular phrase that had an acronym that was WWJD, right? What would Jesus do? And I heard that, and I always thought that there should be a corollary to that, which would be, who would Jesus marginalize? Who would Jesus marginalize or shun? Who would Jesus refuse to serve? Who would Jesus refuse to connect with? Because according to the Gospels, the answer to that question is no one. For Jesus, there was no boundary between us and them. And for him, there was literally no enemy. Think about this. Jesus would often speak about the dangers of wealth, the dangers of greed, and having a lot of money and possessions. But he had wealthy friends and wealthy supporters, people like Mary Magdalene and others who were part of his inner circle. He would touch and heal people who were considered to be unclean, according to the scriptural rules that he was supposed to be following. He had friends like Nicodemus or his disciple Matthew, who were part of the power structure. Matthew was a tax collector. They would have been considered part of what we would call the political opposition, and yet he hung out with them too. And if anyone in those days could be called an enemy, it was the Romans. It was definitely the Romans. They were physically present with an army that was occupying that country. And yet when this Roman centurion comes to Jesus and asks him to heal his servant, well, he did it. No lectures, no scolding. He just did it. You know, Jesus had a different idea about how to deal with people we disagree with or who even oppress us. What are we supposed to do when we find ourselves dealing with an enemy? Well, going back to that passage from Luke again, we can highlight certain words that appear there. We love, we bless, and we give. We love, we bless, and we give. And by giving, we do something. We do the right thing. We offer some sort of tangible good. You know, we can sit around and feel good about what we're doing all we want, but if it doesn't lead to action in the world, nothing changes. Hey, nothing wrong with feeling good, but it can't stop there. So this is the kind of thing that we come up against during Advent. This is a big part of our Christmas message that often gets hidden and tucked away, but it's this invitation to see and shape a world that works according to a different set of rules. It's a world where we're being asked to acknowledge the essential humanity in the people that we want to make out to be the enemy. Doesn't mean we have to take them out to lunch, at least not right away. Might be an option. I'll tell you, whenever I hear these kind of stories, I often wonder, well, is it really working in the real world? I mean, have we made some progress? Is there a practical, real-world example of how this might work? And a couple years ago, I came across this true story about how this whole thing works in real life. This is Daryl Davis. Daryl Davis is a blues piano player from Chicago. And I think we got another picture of him here at the piano. Yes, indeed, there he is. Daryl Davis, back in 1983, he was the only black musician playing in a band in an all-white bar. This is 1983, right? Not 1960 or 55. This bar was not formally segregated, but you get the drift, okay? So a guy from the audience, a white guy from the audience, approaches him and tells him that this was the first time he ever heard a black man play piano as well as Jerry Lee Lewis. Okay, well, you know, and I think he was trying to be complimentary. He apparently never heard of Count Basie or Professor Longhair or, oh my gosh, I mean, I can go on and on. But he said he never heard a black man play piano as well as Jerry Lee Lewis. And Daryl tells him that Jerry Lee learned how to play by emulating the same black blues musicians that inspired him when he learned how to play the piano. And this guy just outright refused to believe that the great Jerry Lee Lewis could have learned anything from a black person, despite Darrell telling him that Jerry Lee was a good friend of his. And they used to talk together about the great New Orleans musicians who inspired them. So, there he is. There's Darrell with Jerry Lee Lewis. Here are a few other of Darrell's friends, by the way. Let's get back to that one. Eric Clapton, Bob Dylan. That's Chuck Berry over there. Anybody recognize Keith Richards in his younger days? Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones. That's Johnny Johnson sitting next to him. Oh, and of course, not just in the musical field. Here we have him with Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton. So that gives everyone a chance to pick out which one they want to call the enemy. And no, I don't want you to do that. Just goes to show you, right? I mean, all encompassing. So Darrell's been around. He's played with all of the greats. He knows what he's talking about. So after a little bit, this conversation, and they were having a conversation, it took an odd turn when this white guy tells him that he was a Klansman, card-carrying member of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, at this point, you might have expected Darrell to say, well, thanks for sharing and have a nice day, as he edged towards the door. But instead, he stayed where he was and kept on talking, because one of the things he had found was that they shared a common language. Music, love of music, and exchanging these stories about what it is that inspires them about the music. So they actually became friends. And this led Darrell down a path where he decided he was going to try contacting other Klansmen over the years. And there's a documentary about this that's out now. I don't think it was out a few years ago when I heard about him. But he started dealing with other Klansmen, making friends with them. And over the years, they say that he's collected the robes of something like, let's go to the next one here, 20 Klansmen who he became friends with, and they decided they were no longer going to put on the hood and the robe and so on and so forth. This next picture, he's holding a couple here that he collected over the years. 20 Klansmen who left the KKK after meeting Darrell. He says that one of the problems with KKK members is that they were essentially brainwashed as children. That's the attitude that he began to develop. And after they actually met him, non-threatening presence, in the flesh, face to face, they couldn't hold on to their prejudice anymore. Now, not everyone he met left the Klan, obviously. That's unrealistic. But that didn't mean that Darrell would cut off contact with them either. They didn't have to leave the Klan in order for him to still have contact with them. So, for example, Darrell was asked to be the pallbearer at the funeral of one of the Klansmen that he met, and he attended the wedding of another. Darrell says that there's only one way to break down barriers, and this is how it works. He said, find someone who disagrees and invite them to your table. Invite your enemy to talk. Give them a platform to talk, because then they will reciprocate. Invite your enemies to sit down and join you. You never know. Some small thing you say might give them food for thought, and you will learn from them. Establish dialogue. It's when the talking stops that the ground becomes fertile for fighting. When two enemies are talking, they're not fighting. Just another way of saying something that Sun Tzu wrote in the book, The Art of War, over 2,000 years ago, right? He said this, he said, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. I found two other pictures. I couldn't decide which one to put up, so let's just, there's another one, and one more. Yeah. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Actually, I think we need to add a line to that. Keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer, and they might just cease to be your enemies. See you next week. Thank you.